What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
David, what a fantastic interview we have for our viewer. The gentleman is Cisco Bradley. He is an author, and the new book is called The Williamsburg Avant Garde Experimental Music and Sound on the Brooklyn Waterfront, and it is available now, David, on Duke University Press in hard copy and digital. What did you think of our conversation with Cisco?
Oh, Pancho! Oh, Cisco!
I think Cisco has a lot of good information to say. He's very much into this avant-garde music, which is very, very cool. Previous book was on the great bassist William Parker. We learned a lot about how to create a scene, how to do it yourself, how to really infuse what you do out on the public. We also learned about how artists, when they come into your neighborhood, that's when the neighborhood ends.
There goes the neighborhood, David. Well, what's great about Cisco is he had his boots on the ground. I mean, he was there. So it's a first-person story in many ways. So he knew many of the venues. He was in Brooklyn. Of course, he talks about the social and political and economic climate, which allowed Brooklyn to happen like it did. And it was really an explosion and very different from the scenes. Well, maybe not so much different from the scenes in London, L.A., and New York, certainly Seattle. People came from all over the world to go to Brooklyn. They really migrated there. Tourists went over there. Artists went there. Lots of famous rockers and jazzers went there. And like you say, when the artists, especially the rock stars, start moving into the neighborhood, there goes the neighborhood. And that neighborhood is gone. I think it's almost as expensive, if not more expensive, than Manhattan in many respects. So.
Well, Tom, we asked the question, where is the next scene? And I think an even better question is, can another scene actually happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the answer to that is yes. As America gets more and more economically depressed and we fall apart spiritually, structurally, economically, there'll be lots of room to make art in the desert somewhere. I don't know. But I think another scene will emerge. But I think there'll be very smaller microbe scenes, if you will. I mean, Brooklyn got a lot of attention. We tell the story, which I've said on this show many times, about the time I was in Cincinnati and I crossed the Routledge Bridge into Kentucky and I stumbled upon a scene. Now, that scene was never documented to my knowledge, and maybe it's just a very little insular scene. You and I have been involved in a very sort of insular Joe Sent Me scene in the East Village with a cadre of musicians we refer to as the Fringe. And it wasn't if for your wife, Nancy August, who documented some of this stuff, it would have pretty much passed and, come and gone. So,
yeah, you're absolutely right about that. But, something else that's very, very interesting to me is our generation, there were no cell phones. This next generation, there are cell phones, there's social media, albeit the algorithms are unfriendly.
Fair.
You just wonder what's next, Tom. Really, what's next? The difference between our generation of quote unquote older musicians is that we are much more energetic, much more in the groove, so to speak. We're not retiring. We're not stopping what we do. It's interesting when you think about retirement. I don't think so.
Retired to what?
New generations coming along. We're really the last generation of the non-cell phone world.
Right.
Yet we do, obviously, you and I are on Zoom as so many others. We embrace what it is with AI, which we did speak about for a little bit.
Yes, we did rant about that. And I'd like to go on more about AI. I think it actually can be used as a good tool, but we'll wait for Cisco to weigh in on that.
There's something interesting about this interview. It went on and on and on because as we just get more and more into it, we take more divergent twists. But we even added an artist, great artist by the name of Linus Coraggio, into the mix. And here's the thing. We got about 2 hours of actual speaking. Now, since our show each week is 2 hours long, I have taken upon myself to make this into a two-parter. I've cut interview in half. So tonight, you're going to be listening to part one. Next week, we have a special guest, Jerry Jamot. Tom, one of the greatest bass players of all time.
One of the greatest bass players, a guy, not only an architect of the instrument, but a pioneer, because Jerry started playing in the early 60s when the instrument was brand spanking new. Lots of reflexes from Jerry. And like us, David, we talk about the Big M. Jerry was all about the Big M, and he's still active.
Exactly.
Well into his
And
80s.
another thing about this particular interview is that it has been picked up by Bass Musician Magazine online as the cover story for the June issue. So if you want to read it, it will be out on June 1st. The interview will be on, what is that, the 4th or the 5th of June, that next Monday. And then the following week, we'll do part 2 of the Cisco Bradley / Linus Coraggio interview.
Okay, and if you're reading Bass Magazine, whether it's online or in the bathroom, and I recommend both, don't forget, David, there's another little article in there by Nanker Fledge, and it's called Bass Life Begins After 60. And would you believe it, David? They interviewed you and I.
I have no idea why they did that.
I don't know.
The
What
other
did he
thing
say?
is it Nanker Fledge or is it Nanker Felge?
Is it Nanker Felge? I don't know.
Or is it Naked Felge?
Naked
I
Fledge.
don't know.
I don't know. We'll see. Well, we haven't got our issue yet, so
We'll have to ask him.
All right, so let's get ready for part 1 of Cisco Bradley and Linus Coraggio. I got to tell you, Francis, this Zoom has been a boon to us. David and I started this show during COVID. I don't know if you saw the list of artists we've spoken to, but
I did. Yeah, it's incredible.
I worked in television for 20 years. What we did in probably 2 years on Zoom, that is a career in television where you actually go on site and interview people. Really, whereas Zoom, the best of times, it's the worst of times, where it's sort of killed things like face-to-face meetings in person. It really, for artists, it's been great. And just to be able to talk to people overseas. I mean, we did a fabulous interview with a couple of bass players in the UK. You know, David and I are bass players.
I love bass players.
You do? Well,
I can't stand bass players, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, my previous book was about a bass player. I don't know if you...
What book was that?
It's called Universal Tonality, The Life and Music of William Parker.
Oh, okay. I'm not really familiar with him. Tell me about William Parker.
Yeah. He's a free jazz bassist, major figure in New York. He's been active since the early 70s. So I wrote his biography.
Here, I live in Manhattan, and there's some things I knew about and some things I didn't. And it just goes to show you how underground the underground was. I actually played in a band or two in Brooklyn in around 2000. So it was like going into a whole different world. And your book is extraordinary because it really gets into it's such a beautiful history of it. I'm like, yeah, I remember that. No, I don't remember that. Let me go back and look at that. And then, of course, you start checking out all the music. It's very similar to the book that one of our guests, Lenny Kay, wrote. And you would really enjoy that one. It's called Lightning Striking. And Lenny goes into all these different scenes, whether it was New Orleans, up in Boston, Seattle, of course, San Francisco, LA. And it really complements your book in that sense, because all these scenes emerge. And it seems to me, after reading your book, that the nature of these scenes is short-lived. They're not really expected to go beyond whatever their particular time frame was. But when you analyze it and you look at it, it's really, really extraordinary.
The Williamsburg scene, I mean, the book covers 25 years, but really the core of it in many ways is probably about 10 years, really.
Right. It must have been what an arduous task researching all this.
Yeah, it was actually a lot of work. I've joked that if I had known what I was getting into, maybe I wouldn't have done it. But I just kind of launched into it and followed it where it led. And it took me about 10 years from start to finish. So
yeah,
I interviewed about 180 people. That alone was crazy. What you were saying about the pandemic, though, really resonated with me, because I finished the interviews for this book during the pandemic. Everyone was available all the time. So it was easy to do. Yeah. And I'm writing another book and I started it during the pandemic, and I found I would contact somebody for an interview and they would say, "Oh yeah, I can talk to you right now." Which is
that was
everyone wanted to talk to someone because, please,
please someone.
And of course, everyone wants to talk about themselves.
And we're here to talk to Cisco Bradley. Cisco, welcome to the show. We're doing this backwards because David was on the telephone to our other guest and coaching him through the 21st century technology known as Zoom, David, right?
That's it. Or News, as we spell it backwards, being a bit dyslexic, right?
The book is the Williamsburg Avant Garde Experimental Music and Sound on the Brooklyn Waterfront. That's a mouthful. It is out now on Duke University Press, okay, in digital and hard copy form. And Cisco, you also write for Jazz Right Now and Jazz Tokyo, yes?
Yes.
And you also curate jazz festivals. And David, he wrote a book about a bass player I had never heard of.
I know that book. It's William Parker. A few of the guys who played in Theorcalus were in Little UE Orchestra. William's a wonderful player and voluminous amount of CDs and stuff. He's done amazing things. He
also has a lot of CDs, and he's also done a lot of things.
He did a few things, yeah. And I think Cecil Taylor was one of his first bands, and then he was with David S. Ware for a while, who's brilliant saxophonist. Yeah, great book. We should push that one as well.
We got to sell as many books as we can.
Yeah, we should get William on the show.
Let's do that.
I'm sure William would love to.
All right, cool.
Yeah. But also, so Cisco, one other thing that's very, very interesting that puts us in very, very close proximity is the fact that my daughter just finished her first year of photography at Pratt.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, she was in the Emerson building.
Okay, yeah. I occasionally have photography majors in my classes, so hope to maybe I'll have her in one of my courses at some point.
All right.
So one of the things that Tom and I have been talking about for the last week or so, because I had already gotten your book, so I had been going through it before, is your book is actually a manual, a do-it-yourself manual on how to create, whether it's a scene or maybe just your own band getting it out there. It brilliantly tells that story as well.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's an incredible pleasure to be here today and get a chance to talk with you both and to dig into the book. Yeah, well, I talked to about 180 musicians in the course of writing this book. And, they all had perspectives on things. And I thought that thinking about how to make a scene, how to create a music scene or an art scene, naturally, I think a thing that we talked about a lot. And I think getting access to space and being able to form a community, to me, those are the two components that you need to have. So, and then to have that happen in New York City, where you have millions of people here, you have critical mass, you have cultural things happening. You have a certain press that kind of covers some of that. And so, I think the Williamsburg scene in a lot of ways came together rather magically. I do make a statement in there. I've always wondered what people thought of it. And I said something like sort of scenes usually begin before anyone's paying attention to them.
Right.
In a way, I think it allows for something organic to happen and a community to form before there's suddenly spotlights and, people kind of zooming in and really choosing who are the stars and, who are not the stars. So I think Williamsburg happened to have that. And I think there's something really special about when that happens. So, the book, as much as it is about music and about sort of this urban setting, I also talk a bit about economics and thinking about kind of, what kind of factors go into making a scene, making it grow, and what goes into making it come undone.
Yeah. Absolutely. One of the things that it made me think about was the fact that growing up in Manhattan, I grew up on the Upper West Side, and so I saw a lot of this going on years and years ago. And the fact that the progenitors of this particular scene are really the artists, because they're the ones that need more space to begin with. And so as you start your book with the scene basically moving from the Lower East Side to Brooklyn, who are the first people to go? The artists. They need room for their canvases. They need room I hope Linus can get on the call, because he and Zwicky were old friends. And, the fact that in your book you talk about how he takes oil drums, cuts them in half, and you need space to do that. You can't do that in a studio apartment, right, Tom?
No, not in my studio apartment, but
exactly. So there's the who came first, the chicken or the egg, and the artists come first, and then the musicians move in.
Yeah, I think, in Williamsburg, a bunch of things just kind of aligned to make it happen, right? You had post-industrial space that had been abandoned by businesses effectively and by residents to some extent. And that allowed it to be kind of repurposed for another, by a wave of artists. And you're right. Artists, people, and especially working in certain, with certain types of, in certain disciplines, need maybe a lot of space, whether it's performance space or space to do physical, visual art, sculpture, various things that kind of take up a lot of space. And of course, music, I guess, takes up a certain kind of space as well.
Sure it does.
Yeah, Williamsburg, I think, really post-industrial sort of abandonment that had happened really kind of set it up for that. And and the fact that it was just a subway stop away from the East Village made it kind of the natural jump for people.
Right. You still had the New York money there, the big New York City money, which, David and I have been questioning now that in post-COVID, we live in a remote world now. And the big money is left New York City. I think one of the things that really summarizes this book is the Anthony Braxton quote. It's all about each individual discovering their own potential and the power of being curious. That's really what all seems
sums it up, right?
About. We have the word avant-garde in the title. How would you define avant-garde? This is something David and I have been grappling about. What is your definition of avant-garde?
I'm sure it's been defined many different ways. I mean, I think the way that I define it in the book is effectively process of creation. In this case, we're talking mainly about music in this book, in which the outcome is not necessarily certain or predetermined, or that the process of creation actually is central to kind of forming it in the moment. So a lot of the music I look at, most of it has strong improvisational elements, where it doesn't mean people are doing random things by any means. I mean, I think really it's about the fact that people are creating something live in front of an audience in the moment and doing it kind of in that way. And to me, that's kind of what I settled on. And the idea of experimentation, where rules are going to be broken. I suppose new rules are maybe formed through the process, and the idea of really striving for something new. So, that push towards the unknown.
We look at the avant-garde and quote-unquote experimental music as something on the fringe, but you think about it, experimental music has always been in the mainstream, at least in the rock era. It certainly had the Grateful Dead and Fish. That was very experimental.
The Beatles, for God's sake.
Sgt. Pepper was experimental. Miles Davis, Electric Miles Davis.
Sure.
Prince and the Revolution. John Coltrane's A Love Supreme was experimental, yet still hit the mainstream. U2 and Eno. Johnny Cash and Rick Rubin. I mean, so it's interesting that experimental music and avant-garde is looked at the fringe, but actually it's more of an expression of art than, say, a canned pop tune and a pop star that goes out and sings the same lyrics and the same melody and plays the same chords over and over again.
Well, what if we did X? I think, and previous people have been sort of thinking in these ways, why don't we go in this other way? I mean, one of the other big, I think, points of experimentation, I mean, maybe this isn't experimentation, but it's more sort of integration or mixing of genres. And that's really happened in the last 20, 25 years. I mean, I think the internet really made that possible, right? Where you used to go to a record store and you'd go to the jazz bin, you had the jazz bin.
Right. It was segregated. Yeah.
And you have rock or you have whatever. And I think in the last 20, 25 years with the internet and everything, I think it just makes everything so much more accessible. So you have people who are listening to Indonesian music or Korean music or Bolivian music or whatever, and then they're just, and they're integrating that into their rock band or whatever, right?
I would stretch that back up a few years earlier. I'm doing this video series, which rankles, that's a big word, David, called Defending the 80s, because that's when I was a working musician, and there's my hideous 80s bass, right? My Steinberger XL bass, which I flaunted.
Looks like it's on a diet. It's missing its head.
David plays a 6-string bass with pink strings, so I have to, this is my only weapon. You talk about MTV and all of its foibles. It still introduced people to lots of different types of music. You heard world music, you heard pop, you heard funk, you heard jazz, and then they finally had black artists on, so you heard hip-hop and things like that. And it's very interesting because the people who came of age during the Brooklyn Renaissance, this avant-garde Renaissance, probably grew up watching MTV and probably saw all these things and thought, well, there is no segregation, like you say, in the 60s and 70s when you had a jazz bin and a folk bin and a pop bin and things like that. So I
hear you on that. I mean, I'm of the MTV generation myself.
There you go.
I was born in 76, so I mean, I grew up hearing that. Honestly, I think my first encounter with hip hop was certainly on MTV. For example. I agree with you. There's definitely some roots to go back.
Yeah. I mean, for me, obviously, I've got 15 years on you, and of course, my introduction to R&B and soul music was AM radio, and this guy Stevie Wonder singing about the inner city, and I lived in a very bucolic suburban environment. David, I'm going to let Linus Brandt in now, okay?
Perfect. Just a point going back to what you guys were saying. I was thinking like you that, the last 25, 30 years. But in retrospect, if we go back to John Cage, that's really where it first began, because he was dealing with dance, he was dealing with art, he was dealing with millions of types of musics. So in its own way, that was like the precursor to all of this stuff.
I mean, I think that it used to be more of a rarity, I think. is maybe one way to look at it. And I think there have been people who've been trying to cut across like that, I think that's really important. It's just become a little bit more common, I think, nowadays for people to do that. And the way that people are trained has maybe changed a little bit too. I mean,
oh, sure.
I feel like it was more common, I think, earlier decades for people to train specifically, I don't know, as a jazz bass player or whatever,
absolutely,
a jazz drummer.
Absolutely, yeah.
That I think has changed a little bit. I mean, there are some people who still do that, but I feel like there's a lot more kind of cross.
Yeah, I think you addressed that in the book. I'm about 40 minutes from Wesleyan. I live up in Connecticut.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And that particular scene was in some ways a groundbreaking compared to when I went to the Berklee College of Music or Tom went to University of Miami jazz program. The whole framework back then was bebop. You had to learn your changes. You had to learn, this, that, and the other thing. Where when you study with Anthony Braxton, sure, there'll be a little bit of that in, but there's so many more, his triaxiom writings and things of that ilk. So you were right in pointing out that the earlier folks were there, but then when these younger musicians came in, they didn't have as many preconceived ideas. Moreover, they were used to embracing electronics as well as acoustic instruments. Now, if you go back to the early 60s, so let's say from Ornette Coleman on Contemporary Records, you had everyone was kind of, these guys can't play. They're just making noise.
Well, that's the impression that experimental music has on the uneducated.
Well, exactly.
To be experimental, you have to be a lot more educated than the average pop producer.
But the point I was going to, Tom, and yes, you are correct, and take your bass and go in the corner now.
Yes, I will do that, David.
but what I was going at is that even those musicians were very strict in their avant. You do this. There are no electric instruments here.
Right.
That started turning. I mean, look at the Jazz Police with Miles Davis. I mean, they were totally in arms with what he was doing then. Right. But this quote unquote Williamsburg migration and a newer group of musicians grew up with all that stuff. Really was a different thing. Now, where I wanted to bring Linus in is because you were writing about the Rivington School and what was going on there. Well, this is the guy who put that whole thing together within what he and I have spoken about and things. The purpose of his art at that time was to do something on the street, not unlike punk music was doing in the clubs. Am I right?
Yes. The street was the immediate and easy option to the impossible to enter Soho gallery system of the early 80s.
And of course, Linus's dad is a very famous avant-garde composer. Cisco, you know of a guy named Henry Brandt?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
That's his pop.
Oh, interesting. Wonderful to meet you.
When you listen to a lot of, we're going to play some of Henry's music on this show.
Getting back to the whole Brooklyn scene, and a big part of it obviously is the economics of it, okay? And what can you, Cisco, can you sort of take us back a little bit? What was it about the Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomfield administrations Bloomberg. What did I say? Mike Bloomfield administration. Do you remember?
He was playing guitar with them.
Right. Yeah. It was the Super Sessions administration.
I'm a victim of circumstance.
Rudy Giuliani. That's David's job, is to correct me on the show. Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg. What was it about their administration? What happened under those administrations that led to the emergence of Brooklyn, viable option for artists?
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot. But I'll try to sum it up.
Some of the main points.
Yeah. So there are a few things. You can even go before Giuliani, back to the late 80s. But I'd say I guess I would say the early roots were the gentrification of the Lower East Side. You know, so the Tompkins Square riots in 1988, I think, was a big moment, because I think that was the beginning of the city kind of using, maybe it's not the beginning, but it was certainly a major instance of the city kind of using police to kind of clear areas and to try to prime a neighborhood for change.
Right, I think the developers were coming in.
Yeah, and if you look, you have people squatting in a whole bunch of buildings in the East Village and people living in Tompkins Square Park, and it's all kind of like that community in the mid to late 80s And by the mid 90s, the Lower East Side is being developed, gentrified,
right,
which is, incredibly detrimental to artists across the board and to other residents, who live there. So I would say that was one thing. 9/11 obviously was a huge thing, and that's not necessarily a policy from those mayors. Federal money flooded, kind of flowed into New York with the rebuilding, and then 9/11 effectively pushed people out from Manhattan who didn't want to live near ground zero and everything. So that was a big moment, because I think suddenly people started to move into Brooklyn. People with high incomes working in finance and so forth that would have never considered living in Brooklyn were suddenly moving there. So the gentrification of the Lower East Side pushed artists into the neighborhood, and then and 11, I would say, pushed the finance people out. I like to quote, there was a musician that said he was walking down the street in somewhere in Williamsburg, I think it was around 2002 or 3, and he said he saw a guy walking down the street wearing khaki pants and a tucked in shirt or something, like a button down shirt, and he said, "Oh, the neighbor, we're fucked, like it's over, like
there goes the neighborhood."
Yeah, there goes the neighborhood, and but I think there's something to be said for that. Suddenly you have a different group of people kind of moving into Williamsburg that had no relationship with the neighborhood before and no interest in it. And they were there because there was riverfront property, being sold off and developed and so forth. So, and then if you think of the next stage, so like the 90s was this sort of like fomenting period of artists in Williamsburg. And then after maybe 2002 on, you start to have, more people showing up and development is happening, and you're getting more waves of artists. In 2005, the rezoning implemented by the Michael Bloomberg administration, utterly devastating to the Williamsburg arts community. Yeah. And honestly, to communities elsewhere in the city. That really is when there's this story that I've heard people tell that Bloomberg was driving down the FDR and he looked across the river and he said, well, at Williamsburg, and he said something to the effect of, wouldn't it be great if we could do something with that? It just looks terrible. And so think about that sort of mentality of like looking across the river at something, almost like it's the frontier, and thinking, okay, we'll go over there and change that. If you look at the language of the rezoning, it was largely, it's really talked about as if there's nobody there right now. Right. It's not being used in an effective way. And we want to increase the city tax base, so let's develop it, and we'll do that. And, that's effectively what happened. And you have mass scale evictions, because with the rezoning, it goes from industrial to residential, and then developers could move in, and then they began to kind of regulate it more according to the laws. A lot of people had been living in post-industrial spaces, that weren't meant for residential. Right. And that's how artists were functioning. So, the economics of it from 2005 on, you can see within a year or two, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of artists who basically lost their spaces. Losing their apartments was one thing, and that was devastating, but losing the art space was, I would say, far more devastating. People could have lived somewhere else and commuted over to Williamsburg to work, maybe that's not ideal, but they could have survived for a bit longer. But I would say that really kind of took it out. Amazing, even by 2010 or 11, there's only, the vast majority of those art spaces were gone.
What effect do you think the internet and digital technology had on the scene? I know this was at the dawn kind of social media, but in our day, David, we would depend on things like the Village Voice or Time Out New York or the Sunday papers, the pink sections, to get the word out about
flyers.
And flyers on a telephone pole. I'm waiting to see the visual artist, the photographer, who had the sense to document all the wonderful artwork you saw.
Well, Tom, I will stop you right there, because when my wife Nancy did that gallery show, she had that Linus was a part of.
Yes.
They had a number of the flyers all around the gallery. So there's another artist named Julius Klein. I don't know if you know who he is, Cisco, but he saved a ton of these, and so she made copies and put them all around the room. So it was kind of cool.
Well, there's an interesting part in the book where you talk about New Sonic, and they avoided print media, communication, advertising, because that attracted police. So you really had to be in some sort of a clique to know what was going on, because some of the things I remembered when you talk about Otto's Shrunken Head, one of those places I've been to several times, played there. But a lot of these places, like, gosh, I wish I had known about that. So the scene was kind of fragmented, even though it was looked at as a scene. It was really fragmented, with little cliques going on here and there, at least as far as I can tell.
Talking about the advertising and everything, a lot of people in the early towns, they just talk about putting flyers and posters up on like light poles and
Right.
near subway stations and all of that. I mean, and the beauty of that is that a lot of those still survive. I mean, people may have kept like one copy of each flyer or something,
Right.
so they kept their own archive. I find like from the transition from that into digital, a lot of times you just, like as a historian trying to document this and write about it, like suddenly you lose your archive because a lot of the digital stuff just, people don't think to keep it or whatever. And emails get deleted after a certain time period.
Sure.
So, lose all of that. So yeah, I mean, I think this is really kind of before, it's really the early parts of like something like Facebook, but like MySpace, I think was a site.
Right. That was this go-to site.
I think for newcomers, for people coming from other parts of the country, sometimes the internet might be how they found out about it or somehow connected with it at first.
Sure.
But the beauty of Williamsburg is that if you look at like really where artists settled, especially in North Williamsburg, but stretching down into South Williamsburg a little bit. I mean, it was entirely walkable. You could go from one end of the to the other in, 15, 20 minutes or something. So, or whatever, however long it takes. So it was a pretty close-knit community. If we're thinking about media, I think the other thing, it's in the second chapter of the book where I talk about the pirate radio station that was there.
Right, yes. Free 109.
Yeah.
Their broadcasts were a very small range. I don't even think it covered all of Williamsburg. Or maybe at best it covered all of Williamsburg. So, and clearly they were writing about an art scene broadcasting about an art scene that was there and really just connecting with the community that was right there.
Yeah.
Definitely, sort of a hyper local sort of orientation in a way.
Sort of like the precursors of the forerunners of the podcast.
But with that in mind, Tom and I were talking before we got on Zoom. In the book, you were talking about people coming from the University of Michigan, whether it was a school in Ohio, here, there, and everywhere. Mm-hmm. And they were coming to New York because at that point, we still thought New York was the scene. But now, Tom was out in Cincinnati and he crossed the bridge over.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story. You talk about scenes. We were going to ask you where the scenes were. I remember when I have a group of musicians, our bucket list is to see all 30 baseball stadiums. So we went to see the Cincinnati Reds. And when you cross the Roebling Bridge, you go into Kentucky. You go into this little town called Covington, Kentucky. And I swear to God, I was in Brooklyn in 1999 when I was there. And this was only a couple of years ago. And there was a scene there. There was an actual art and music scene. And you would never imagine that in Kentucky. But again, the economics are fertile there. It's low rent. There's industrial space there. I looked around. And many of the things I remember from seeing in this Covington, Kentucky, I said, oh, this is in your book. And that really for artists to do anything, the economic scene has to be a certain way. It's almost like it happens by accident. It was the same thing in Haight-Ashbury in 1967. It was cheap to live in Haight-Ashbury, so that's where the artists went. Same thing with Seattle in the 1990s. And of course,
I think you're probably right, and I think that signals like the cultural spaces really are shifting in the U.S.
Yeah.
The city centers are becoming, they were fairly cheap in 70s and 80s, 90s maybe, depending on the place. But,
right.
That's completely changed, right? I mean, now you have places where you could have bought a house for $20,000 in, 1984.
Right.
Today, that house is worth $4 million or something in Brooklyn. Right. I mean, think of places like that. Naturally, I think, artists aren't going to go to those places if they can't afford to live there. I mean, I love New York and I've lived here for a long time, but I think, well, maybe that's actually good. Maybe it's good. I've always thought, New York just has so many, you think of and I was talking with a musician many years ago. He said, you might, if you're in Chicago, maybe there are 15 saxophone players that you should be aware of. That in New York, that it might be 150 or it might be 80, whatever it is. Maybe it's, and I feel, at the same time, I think, much of the country, I say this as someone came from a small town in the Midwest. I always felt like where I grew up, people were cultural consumers. There wasn't much support.
Where did you grow up, Cisco?
Small town in Wisconsin. North of Madison, about 45 minutes. So it wasn't a bad town, but it's like one of these small Midwestern towns where, they had a big prison. I mean, there wasn't much to really open people's minds there or to get people to really think about, the bigger world or what was possible. I think in places like that, people just feel kind of disconnected a lot of the time, because there's not a lot happening locally in terms of culture. I mean, people have a certain culture, but the idea of like becoming an artist or creating something or really doing something innovative or something new or visionary or whatever, I don't think it's just not something that people are encouraged to do or really have a community in which to do it. So much of creation process, I think, is about communicating with other people. You have a community. One person's doing one thing, one other person's doing another thing. We're all kind of influencing, they're all influencing each other. So maybe the diffusing of American culture is actually a good thing. I don't know. I love cities and I love living in New York. So I hope artists continue to find ways to
Well, a scene also needs a money center to thrive. I remember when I worked in television news several years ago, we did a story on Detroit. Now, of course, the auto industry abandoned Detroit and there was nothing left but industrial space. So artists started flocking there because you could get a house for $600 in Detroit. And I was there, and it was pretty derelict and pretty dangerous, just like the East Village was, and probably Brooklyn as well. And there were very innovative people. They were making, one person was making houses and structures out of discarded plastic. I believe it was Kid Rock that started a business with some locals where he was making jackets and jeans and bags out of tires, out of abandoned tires. But the problem with that was there was no affluence to buy the art and to buy the products. Certainly you had Woodland Hills, which is the affluent the suburb of Detroit, but it needed more of an economic structure for these artists to survive. We were talking about when I was a kid, I grew up in the mean streets of Long Island, suburbia. And my mother would take me to the Greenwich Village Art Fair every year, and we'd go there. My mother would buy paintings from a Sally Cooper-Schmidt. Sally probably lived in an East Village apartment for $50 a month, but here comes my mother from Long Island with, $200 to buy a painting, and that was, 3 months rent for her. She had other people that come, and so you needed that money. And the thing with New York now that New York is no longer going to be an economic base, you don't have to be here to do business. You wonder if another scene will emerge as people need spaces to live. Where do you see another scene cropping up, or is it possible to tell where there are scenes, what areas are fertile?
Oh man, that's a great question. Well, I'm not giving up on New York by any means. I do think that, what I notice is the New York music, the musicians that I know, the community that I've been around a lot, I feel like they just keep moving further south in Brooklyn, and there's a lot of, there is a lot of distance to go there, and so I think there's stuff like that, and a lot of, I think, to an extent, the Hudson Valley, they're connected enough to New York, and you have people who are up there maybe doing their work and then presenting it in New York City. So you have these sort of, I don't know, maybe they're satellite sort of artistic communities a little bit. But, in terms of like a dynamic urban art scene, that's a great question. I think of a city like Philadelphia has inherited a lot of New Yorkers. I mean, just people moving there, people who have left the city. There's certainly places like that. I mean, if you think New York has struggled to hold on to its kind of art scene spaces, you look at a city like San Francisco, I think it's even worse.
Oh, I lived in San Francisco for 5 years. Back in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, what's happened in San Francisco strikes me is even more devastating. I mean, New York, there's a lot of area to expand.
Right.
There's a lot of places for people to go.
But not.
You have people living out in New Jersey. You have people living in Connecticut. I mean, I have artist friends who have moved to Connecticut, upstate New York, and all that. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like what we think of as a community is maybe changing a little bit. And I don't know that it's always. There is something to be said for living down the street from your collaborators, and I think that can't be completely replicated with the Zoom or with the internet or with technology, but I think different kinds of communities are forming, kind of in the wake of that. I wrote a book about William Parker, and I spent a lot of time around the free jazz generation that he came up with in the 70s. And what I'm always amazed is they always say, oh yeah, I lived on, 6th Street, and then, so-and-so lived over on 8th Street, and then, down the street, there was not, So like that kind of community, I think, is pretty special in terms of something like music, which is a collaborative art form. I mean, it is different than, at least to some extent, than some of the visual arts where you maybe create primarily by yourself, even though communication is important. Music, I mean, most of the time you're going to need to meet, you're going to need to be with those other people. So that creates a necessity for things. I'm thinking of where else. I mean, I think Chicago. Why not Chicago? Chicago, has its challenges, but Chicago's had a lot of economic challenges, but I think that has made it possible for an art scene to be there. And I think that the music that I follow, the free jazz, experimental noise, that very, sort of range of musics, I always think of Chicago as like maybe the second city of a lot of that. I think there's a lot of
art
I think there's more stuff happening in LA. I know a lot of Bay Area artists that moved to LA You know, when things got just impossible in San Francisco, they're like, well, Los Angeles, I don't know. I haven't spent enough time in LA to really assess it there. I've been in Detroit recently. I'm actually, my book covers certain aspects of Detroit. I think that I'm wondering if it just is going to take a little bit longer in Detroit or something. You're right, though. The financial base needs to be there. Maybe that's missing in Detroit.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Yeah, I know that they had the economic development. I think Governor Granholm was pushing that, and we did a lot of television with her to get federal money into Detroit, and that didn't happen for whatever reason.
But you know what? I think there's another aspect of this that's really important. You know how it almost looks like every 20 years or so that the avant garde is going to finally break through, and something's going to happen with it. Well, right now, we're in probably one of the worst places politically, economically, worldwide. And this is when artists and musicians are needed most. So I'm pondering the fact that maybe each region is going to try and come up with something that will be substantial. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in New York. I used to hang out at the Fillmore. I used to go to Slugs when I was like 14 and 15. I miss that. I also miss and you're 100% right on. I'm 2 hours away. I'm in a town where there's more llamas and goats and cows than people. And so a 2-hour drive into the city to either perform or hang out is also a 2-hour drive home at midnight, 2 in the morning or something.